Witold Pilecki's story begins not with a grand flourish, but with the quiet resolve of a man who would become one of the most courageous and tragic figures of the 20th century. Born in 1901 to a Polish noble family, Pilecki's early years were shaped by the turbulent history of Eastern Europe, a region often torn between powerful empires. Growing up in the Russian partition of Poland, Pilecki witnessed firsthand the oppression of his people, an experience that would lay the foundation for his lifelong commitment to resistance and sacrifice. As a young man, Pilecki chose the path of military service, joining the Polish army at a time when the country was experiencing both the resurgence of its independence and the lingering shadows of foreign control. By the time World War II erupted, Poland had regained its sovereignty after more than a century of partitions. But the brief period of independence was soon shattered by the invasion of Nazi Germany in September 1939, followed by the Soviet invasion from the east. Poland, caught between two of the most brutal totalitarian regimes in history, was overrun, and its fate would be sealed for the next several decades. In the chaos of the war, Pilecki, a man already imbued with a sense of duty to his nation, was not content with simply defending his homeland in the conventional sense. He sought to do more. Pilecki recognized that the survival of Poland, and indeed the survival of humanity, required more than just military engagement on the battlefield. It required an ability to understand and confront the very heart of Nazi brutality. This realization would lead him to make one of the most extraordinary decisions of his life. In 1940, Pilecki volunteered for a mission that was, at first, almost unimaginable. He would allow himself to be captured by the Germans and sent to Auschwitz, a concentration camp that, at the time, was little known outside of Nazi-controlled Europe. His goal was to infiltrate the camp, gather intelligence on the horrors being committed within its walls, and ultimately organize a resistance movement from within. Pilecki's decision was driven by a profound belief that the fight against evil could not be won by mere military tactics. It had to be fought on the moral and spiritual front lines as well. To willingly subject oneself to the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz, knowing the risks, was a testament to the depth of his commitment. The mission was nothing short of a personal sacrifice. Pilecki left behind his wife, Maria, and their two young children, knowing that he might never see them again. He knew the dangers, and yet he believed that the survival of his people and of Europe hinged on the information he could gather from within the heart of the Nazi machine. In many ways, Pilecki's decision to enter Auschwitz was not only a military and intelligence mission, it was an act of selflessness on a scale few can comprehend. When Pilecki was finally arrested and sent to Auschwitz, the nightmare he entered was beyond anything even he could have anticipated. Auschwitz, a name that would become synonymous with the horrors of the Holocaust, was already in full operation by the time Pilecki arrived. The scale of the camp's brutality, its sheer inhumanity, was overwhelming. But Pilecki, despite the overwhelming odds, quickly adapted to his new surroundings, using his military training and intellect to begin organizing resistance efforts among the prisoners. In doing so, he would lay the groundwork for one of the most remarkable resistance movements within the camp. While many of the prisoners in Auschwitz were broken by the brutality they endured, Pilecki maintained his focus, never allowing the horror of his circumstances to break his resolve. He began to send reports back to the Polish resistance and the Allies, detailing the atrocities being committed by the Nazis and urging them to take action. His reports were often smuggled out by other prisoners, as the Nazis did everything in their power to prevent any information from escaping the camp. These reports would eventually become some of the most important documents of the Holocaust, revealing the scale of Nazi atrocities long before the full extent of the Holocaust was widely understood. Despite the constant threat of death and the cruelty of his captors, Pilecki's spirit never faltered. He was a man of extraordinary resilience, someone who would not be crushed by the weight of oppression or the certainty of his own suffering. Even as he endured unimaginable hardship, he continued to fight, not only for his own survival, but for the survival of his fellow prisoners and for the future of Poland and Europe. His leadership within the camp was nothing short of extraordinary, as he organized secret meetings, provided aid to fellow prisoners, and ultimately helped to form the first underground resistance group within Auschwitz itself. At the heart of Pilecki's mission was the unshakable belief in the power of resistance. He was not merely content to survive. He sought to inspire others to resist as well. And this resistance took many forms. Some prisoners resisted by sabotaging the camp's operations, while others resisted by offering what little aid they could to their fellow inmates. Pilecki's resistance was rooted in a deep sense of moral conviction, and it was this conviction that sustained him during his darkest days. The mission that Pilecki undertook in Auschwitz was not simply about gathering intelligence or assisting in the eventual liberation of the camp. It was about defying the Nazis in every possible way. By continuing to fight, even in the most brutal of circumstances, Pilecki symbolized a defiance that was not just physical, but spiritual. He refused to allow the Nazis to break his spirit, and in doing so, he provided a beacon of hope for those around him. Yet, the danger was ever present. Every day in Auschwitz was a day that could be his last. The Gestapo, the SS, and the camp guards were all eager to uncover the resistance within, and Pilecki knew that he was constantly at risk of discovery. It was a constant battle to maintain his cover while also carrying out his mission. But even as the risk of exposure grew, Pilecki remained steadfast, believing that the success of his mission depended on his ability to stay within the camp and continue his work. Pilecki's story is, above all, one of incredible bravery and unshakable resolve. His willingness to sacrifice himself for a cause greater than his own survival is a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable evil. In his mind, the fight against the Nazis was not just about winning a war. It was about preserving the values of humanity, dignity, and honor in the face of one of the greatest evils the world had ever known. While Pilecki's mission in Auschwitz would not reach its ultimate conclusion for several more years, the foundations of his legacy were already being laid. His ability to endure, to resist, and to inspire others to do the same set him apart as one of the greatest heroes of World War II. His story is not just a tale of courage in the face of tyranny. It is a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there are those who refuse to give up, who continue to fight, and who ultimately refuse to let evil prevail. Pilecki's decision to enter Auschwitz voluntarily remains one of the most extraordinary acts of heroism in history. It was not a decision born of desperation, but of conviction. He did not go to Auschwitz to save himself, but to save others. His actions would later be recognized, though his name would not become widely known until many years after the war had ended. The depth of his sacrifice and the scope of his courage are beyond measure. But his story serves as a reminder that there are always those who will stand up against injustice, no matter the cost. The first days of Witold Pilecki's life inside Auschwitz were marked by a mixture of horror, disbelief, and tactical necessity. Although he had anticipated the brutality of the camp, the reality was far worse than he could have imagined. The scale of the suffering was overwhelming. But it was within this abyss of human depravity that Pilecki would begin his extraordinary mission of resistance. From the moment he arrived, he understood that survival would not be enough. His mission was not merely to live, but to fight, to gather intelligence, and to organize. Despite the crushing despair that enveloped Auschwitz, Pilecki began his work almost immediately, determined to ensure that the world would know of the horrors unfolding behind the camp's walls. The conditions inside Auschwitz were beyond anything Pilecki had previously encountered. The camp was an industrialized death machine, a place where humanity was systematically destroyed. Prisoners were forced to endure physical abuse, starvation, disease, and brutal forced labor. The camp's layout itself was designed to maximize control and dehumanization. The men, women, and children arriving from all over Europe were sorted, stripped of their identities, and subjected to a cruel and systematic process that sought to break both their bodies and spirits. Every day, the dead bodies of the murdered were piled into mass graves or burned in crematoriums, their lives erased without ceremony. Yet amidst this horror, Pilecki's mind remained focused on his mission. He knew that he had to survive, But he also knew that his survival alone would not be enough. His task was to gather information, to document the atrocities, and to organize the inmates in resistance. Pilecki quickly realized that Auschwitz was not just a place of death, but also a place of deception. For the Nazis, Auschwitz was a site of mass extermination disguised as a labor camp, a fact that would only become fully understood in later years. To survive in Auschwitz was not just to endure the violence, but also to navigate the brutal hierarchies within the camp. There were the SS guards, the capos, prisoners who were given power over others, and the inmates themselves, many of whom had already been broken by the system. Pilecki had to understand this internal structure to avoid detection and to figure out how best to mobilize the prisoners. In the early days, he kept a low profile, learning the rhythm of camp life, observing the routines, and assessing the physical and psychological state of the prisoners. He began to forge relationships with fellow inmates, many of whom were too terrified to resist. He knew that if he was going to create any kind of underground network, he would need to gain the trust of those around him. This process was slow and deliberate, requiring him to balance the need for secrecy with the necessity of forging bonds of solidarity. Pilecki's ability to remain calm, to treat those around him with dignity, and to inspire hope in even the most broken of men became key to his work. Through these early interactions, Pilecki began to form a network of like-minded individuals, people who were willing to resist, to fight back against the Nazi regime, even if it meant certain death. This underground resistance movement, later known as the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZOW, would become one of the most important forces within Auschwitz. But Pilecki was not merely concerned with organizing resistance within the camp. He was equally focused on smuggling out information. His first reports, sent to the Polish resistance and the Allies, were a mixture of horror and urgency. He described in detail the atrocities being committed by the Nazis, the mass killings, the systematic extermination of Jews, and the brutal conditions that prisoners endured. These reports were not merely cries for help. They were a call to action, a plea for the world to take notice of what was happening. The early reports Pilecki sent out were often passed through complicated channels, relying on fellow prisoners who risked their lives to deliver the messages. The Nazis had strict controls in place to prevent any information from escaping, and Pilecki's communication efforts were fraught with danger. If the Gestapo discovered the network of resistance within the camp, the consequences would be catastrophic. Despite these risks, Pilecki was resolute. His belief in the importance of his mission kept him going, even in the face of constant danger. Every smuggled report, every piece of intelligence that made its way out of Auschwitz brought a sense of purpose to his suffering. As time passed, Pilecki's network within the camp grew stronger. He was able to connect with more and more prisoners, including many who had previously been too frightened to resist. Some were fellow soldiers, others were intellectuals, and some were simply ordinary people who had been caught in the Nazi web. Regardless of their background, Pilecki sought to unite them in a common cause. He wanted to show them that resistance was possible, that survival was not a matter of passively accepting one's fate. This was a message that many prisoners were reluctant to hear at first, for the overwhelming weight of the camp's brutality had crushed their hope. But Pilecki was not easily deterred. He knew that hope could be a weapon, and he used it as best he could, even if it was just a spark in the darkness. In addition to organizing resistance efforts, Pilecki also sought to help the prisoners in more immediate ways. He provided food and medical supplies to those in need, often at great personal risk. He offered comfort to those who had lost everything, listening to their stories and offering them solace. Pilecki's ability to empathize with the suffering of others became one of his most remarkable traits. In a place where dehumanization was the norm, Pilecki's sense of compassion remained intact. His actions were not driven by the need for recognition or glory, but by an unwavering belief in the importance of preserving human dignity. Yet, even as Pilecki built his underground network and resisted the Nazis in every way he could, he was also constantly confronted by the question of how to gather more intelligence. He needed to know more about the operations of the camp, the number of prisoners being murdered, and the logistics of the extermination process. To do this, he would have to take enormous risks. One of the most dangerous aspects of his mission was the need to observe and document the process of mass murder. Pilecki knew that to bring attention to the scale of the atrocities being committed, he would need concrete evidence. He began to collect information about the gas chambers, the crematoriums, and the transport of prisoners to their deaths. Every detail he gathered would later become a part of the crucial evidence that would be used to expose the full scale of the Holocaust. But it was not just the physical conditions of Auschwitz that concerned Pilecki. He was also deeply disturbed by the psychological toll the camp was taking on the prisoners. He saw firsthand how the trauma of the camp broke people in ways that were hard to understand. Men and women who had once been strong and proud were reduced to shadows of themselves, either by fear, starvation, or the brutal treatment they received from the Nazis. Yet Pilecki never allowed himself to succumb to despair. He saw the suffering around him, but he refused to let it consume him. Instead, he used it as fuel for his mission. The more he saw, the more he understood the importance of his work. Throughout his time in Auschwitz, Pilecki remained committed to the idea that resistance was not just about military action. It was about moral action. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, he believed that every small act of defiance mattered. Whether it was offering a kind word to a fellow prisoner, sabotaging Nazi operations, or smuggling out intelligence, Pilecki knew that each act of resistance was a blow to the Nazi regime. And in the darkest hours, when the weight of the camp seemed unbearable, Pilecki would remind himself that he was not alone. Though the walls of Auschwitz were designed to isolate and break those within, Pilecki's underground network, his fellow resistance fighters, and his unwavering belief in the power of hope ensured that he would never be fully defeated. The second chapter of Pilecki's time in Auschwitz was marked by the dawning realization that the fight for survival was not simply a matter of enduring, but of acting. For Pilecki, this meant building an underground resistance, gathering intelligence, and offering hope to those around him. It was a quiet defiance, a refusal to allow the Nazis to erase the humanity of those trapped within Auschwitz. Through his courage, leadership, and compassion, Pilecki proved that even in the most brutal of circumstances, resistance was possible, and that the fight for dignity, justice, and survival could continue, even in the darkest corners of the earth. As Witold Pilecki continued to establish himself as a leader within the confines of Auschwitz, the brutal reality of his situation deepened. Despite his unwavering resolve, the scale of Nazi cruelty and the constant presence of death within the camp weighed heavily on him. With each passing day, Pilecki became more acutely aware of the deepening depravity of his surroundings and the immense task that lay ahead. Yet, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, his sense of purpose did not falter. He knew that his mission was far from over, and that the resistance he was building within Auschwitz could not afford to be passive. It was a fight not just for survival, but for the very soul of humanity, against the evil that sought to exterminate not only people, but their dignity and their will to resist. As the months passed, Pilecki's activities inside the camp grew more dangerous. His network of resistance fighters, the ZOW, had expanded significantly, and more prisoners were beginning to trust him and join the effort. He had already made contact with various groups within the camp, from fellow soldiers to intellectuals, from Jews to non-Jewish Poles, and had started to coordinate a series of sabotage activities designed to weaken the Nazi operations. These acts of resistance were carefully planned, subtle but effective. Whether it was disrupting the camp's operations or undermining the logistical efficiency of the Nazis, each small victory was a powerful blow to the invaders' sense of control. But the more the resistance within Auschwitz grew, the more dangerous it became. The Nazis were growing increasingly suspicious of the prisoners, and the risk of discovery was ever present. Pilecki had to balance the need for secrecy with the urgency of his mission. Any mistake, any slip-up could result in mass executions or the complete unraveling of the underground network. Every action had to be calculated, and even the smallest slip could lead to disastrous consequences. This pressure weighed heavily on Pilecki, But he never lost sight of his ultimate goal, to secure enough evidence and intelligence to bring the atrocities of Auschwitz to the outside world. In parallel with his efforts to build and strengthen the resistance, Pilecki also worked tirelessly to maintain his cover within the camp. He knew that if he were to be discovered, his mission would end, and the lives of many innocent people would be lost. He kept a low profile whenever possible, blending in with the other prisoners, participating in the grueling labor, and maintaining a facade of compliance. But despite the constant risk of exposure, Pilecki remained steadfast. His goal was not simply to survive. It was to continue to resist, to gather evidence, and to bring hope to those around him. Pilecki's capacity for empathy was one of his defining traits, and it became all the more crucial as he navigated the horrors of Auschwitz. It was not just the physical suffering that weighed on him. It was the psychological toll of watching countless prisoners lose their humanity under the weight of Nazi cruelty. The camp was a place of unspeakable brutality, where people were reduced to mere numbers and stripped of their identities. Yet, through it all, Pilecki worked tirelessly to remind the prisoners of their worth. He offered words of comfort and support to those who had lost everything, showing them that even in the darkest of times, resistance, however small, was still possible. His leadership was a beacon in the bleakest of places, and though he could not always protect his fellow inmates from the horrors that surrounded them, he did everything he could to offer them a glimmer of hope. Despite his best efforts, the brutality of Auschwitz continued to escalate. The Nazis were determined to maintain their iron grip on the camp, and as the war raged on, the scale of their atrocities grew. The numbers of those sent to the gas chambers and crematoria increased, as did the sophistication of the methods used to murder the innocent. But even as the death toll mounted, Pilecki did not waver. He continued to document the horrors, sending out more reports to the Polish resistance, the Allies, and anyone who would listen. He described in detail the mechanisms of mass murder, the transport of victims, the workings of the gas chambers, and the extermination process that had become a daily routine. His reports were not only a record of the Nazis' cruelty, but also a desperate call to action. One of Pilecki's greatest challenges was not just gathering intelligence, but ensuring that it reached the outside world. The Nazis had a near-total control over the prisoners' communications, and the risk of information being intercepted was immense. To smuggle out reports, Pilecki relied on a network of trusted individuals within the camp, people who were willing to risk their lives to get the truth to those who could act on it. But these acts of defiance were fraught with peril. Prisoners who were caught attempting to pass along information were often executed on the spot, and the network was always at risk of being uncovered. Pilecki's ability to orchestrate this underground communication system was nothing short of extraordinary. His reliance on others was a testament to his leadership and his belief in the collective strength of the resistance. He knew that without the support of his fellow inmates, the mission would fail. Pilecki's ability to think strategically was also crucial in navigating the complexities of the camp's power structures. He had to contend not only with the brutal Nazis, but also with the capos, the prisoner functionaries who had been given power over their fellow inmates. While some capos were sympathetic to the plight of the prisoners, others were just as brutal as the Nazi guards themselves. Pilecki's diplomatic skills were tested as he had to navigate this complex and often hostile environment. He worked to gain the trust of as many capos as possible, hoping that their influence would help protect the resistance network. In this environment, where betrayal was common, trust was a rare commodity, and Pilecki's ability to build alliances, even with those who held power over the other prisoners, was critical to his survival and the success of his mission. While the work of resistance continued within the camp, Pilecki's thoughts often turned to the outside world. He knew that the longer the war dragged on, the more people would be murdered in Auschwitz and the other concentration camps. His mission was urgent, and with each passing day, the weight of the lives lost pressed more heavily on him. He had no illusions about the difficulty of his task, but he also knew that giving up was not an option. The world needed to know the truth about what was happening in Auschwitz. The full scale of the genocide was not yet widely understood, And Pilecki believed that exposing the Nazis' crimes would not only help stop the atrocities, but also ensure that history would never forget the victims. As Pilecki's role in the resistance deepened, the scope of his activities expanded. He was no longer just gathering intelligence and coordinating resistance efforts. He had become an integral part of the underground network that was working to bring down the Nazi regime from within the camp. His influence grew as more and more prisoners rallied around the idea that they could fight back. His leadership was no longer limited to the prisoners in Auschwitz. It spread to other parts of Poland and beyond, as the information he sent out began to inform the larger resistance efforts against the Nazis. Throughout all of this, Pilecki maintained a single-minded determination to fulfill his mission. His own suffering, his physical exhaustion, and the emotional toll of the atrocities around him never caused him to lose focus. He understood that the fate of thousands, perhaps millions, depended on his success. And although the odds were insurmountably high, he remained resolute. Each day in Auschwitz brought new challenges, new threats, and new dangers, but Pilecki's will was unyielding. He had made a promise to himself, to his country, and to the memory of those who had already perished. He would not give in. He would resist, document, and fight back in whatever ways he could, for as long as he had the strength to do so. By the third chapter of his time in Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki had transformed from an isolated prisoner into the leader of a clandestine resistance movement, a figure whose courage and resolve set him apart from the others in the camp. Despite the dire circumstances, Pilecki remained an unwavering symbol of defiance against the forces of evil, refusing to let the darkness around him extinguish the flame of resistance. His actions within the camp were not just those of a survivor, but of a man who believed, deep in his heart, that the fight against the Nazi regime could never be abandoned, not even in the most brutal and despairing place on earth. Witold Pilecki's continued existence inside Auschwitz was defined by a growing sense of urgency. As the months turned into years, and the scale of the atrocities committed by the Nazis continued to unfold, the resistance within the camp, under Pilecki's guidance, faced increasing challenges. The conditions of the camp were deteriorating, with brutality becoming ever more systematic and the methods of extermination more efficient. Yet, despite the overwhelming horrors, Pilecki's resolve to infiltrate and expose the depths of Nazi evil never wavered. His mission had evolved, taking on greater significance as the war progressed. The intelligence he gathered from within Auschwitz was becoming more critical, not only for the Polish resistance, but for the Allies and the future of Europe. The more Pilecki observed the inner workings of Auschwitz, the more he understood the scale and sophistication of the Nazi machinery of death. The camp was no longer just a place of random violence. It was a deliberate and organized system of genocide, one that was rapidly expanding its reach. Auschwitz was just one of many camps in the Nazi network, but it was quickly becoming the epicenter of the Holocaust. The Nazis had already developed a ruthless industrial process for the systematic murder of millions, and Auschwitz, with its numerous gas chambers and crematoria, was central to this process. The stories that Pilecki had initially heard from other prisoners were now being confirmed in horrifying detail, and the reports he sent out became more urgent, filled with a desperate plea for intervention. One of the most damning pieces of information Pilecki gathered was the systematic transportation of Jews, Romani people, and other persecuted groups from across Europe to the camp. The trains that arrived at Auschwitz carried thousands of people, many of whom were immediately sent to the gas chambers upon arrival. Pilecki documented the brutal sorting process, where the newly arrived prisoners were separated into those who were deemed fit for work and those who were marked for extermination. The cruelty was unfathomable. Entire families were torn apart in an instant, their fate sealed the moment they set foot in the camp. For Pilecki, witnessing this relentless dehumanization was a constant source of horror. Yet, it also steeled his resolve, making him more determined to document every aspect of the Nazis' genocidal operations. As Pilecki's network within the camp grew, so did the risks. The ZOW, the resistance group that he had helped establish, was operating under increasingly perilous conditions. The prisoners who had joined the resistance had their own fears to overcome. Many had lost their will to resist after witnessing the unspeakable brutality of the Nazis, and convincing them to take action was no small task. Others had been betrayed by fellow prisoners who had been coerced into working for the Nazis, creating an atmosphere of distrust and paranoia. The fear of being exposed was ever present, and each day brought new threats to the survival of the underground movement. Despite this, Pilecki's leadership was unmatched. He inspired loyalty in his fellow prisoners through his unwavering determination, his quiet authority, and his willingness to share in their suffering. One of the most difficult aspects of the resistance work was ensuring that the intelligence Pilecki gathered reached the outside world. The Nazis had implemented strict controls over the prisoners' communications, and the likelihood of detection was high. Prisoners were subjected to regular searches, and any hint of resistance or defiance was met with swift and brutal retribution. The resistance had to be creative, using every possible means to smuggle out the information. Pilecki's own role as a courier of intelligence became increasingly dangerous, but he was determined to keep the flow of information going. He relied on other trusted members of the resistance to smuggle messages out of the camp, often risking their own lives in the process. These reports were essential, not just for the Polish resistance, but for the Allies who were still unaware of the full scale of the Holocaust. Pilecki's messages were filled with urgent details about the number of victims being murdered, the methods of extermination, and the operational efficiency of the Nazis' genocidal machine. In addition to his intelligence-gathering efforts, Pilecki worked tirelessly to provide comfort and support to the other prisoners. The psychological toll of life in Auschwitz was immense. The prisoners were subjected to constant abuse, forced labor, starvation, and the ever-present threat of death. The trauma of living in such a place, where survival itself seemed like a fleeting hope, was overwhelming. Many prisoners had already lost their will to live, and Pilecki's compassion became a vital source of strength for them. He was able to offer words of encouragement, to remind them of their worth, and to inspire hope, even when the camp's horrors seemed to strip away all semblance of humanity. Pilecki also made efforts to help the sick and the injured, despite the impossibility of providing real medical care in such a place. He would smuggle food, clothing, and even medical supplies whenever he could, though these were always in short supply. The camp's medical staff, made up of Nazi doctors and other personnel, were more concerned with experimentation and the death of prisoners than with any notion of care. Pilecki's knowledge of military medicine and his compassion allowed him to offer what little help he could, though the conditions were so dire that even his efforts were often insufficient. His leadership in the ZOW was a beacon of hope for many, but it also put him at even greater risk. The Nazis had begun to crack down harder on any signs of resistance, increasing the frequency of searches and implementing harsher punishments for any acts of defiance. Prisoners who were caught attempting to resist or escape were often executed publicly, as a warning to others. Pilecki knew that any slip-up, any failure to remain covert, could lead to the entire resistance being exposed. He had to remain vigilant, constantly assessing the situation and adapting to the changing conditions. Each act of sabotage, each piece of intelligence that was smuggled out, carried the risk of death, but Pilecki was undeterred. His mission was too important to abandon. Over time, the scale of the resistance efforts grew, as did the sophistication of the operations within the camp. Pilecki began to recruit more individuals to assist in the sabotage efforts. The prisoners within Auschwitz had been broken down, reduced to shadows of their former selves, but many still retained their desire to fight. Pilecki's persistence in the face of such overwhelming odds gave them the strength to join in the resistance efforts. The underground movement organized acts of sabotage, including slowing down the work details and even sabotaging the camp's equipment. The ZOW also carried out a series of covert actions to help prisoners escape, though the risk of being caught was incredibly high. These acts of resistance were small, yet each one sent a message to the Nazis that the spirit of defiance could not be fully crushed. As Pilecki's network grew in strength, so did the scale of the intelligence he was able to provide. He had already begun sending detailed reports about the extermination process, and as he learned more about the Nazis' methods of mass murder, he was able to paint a more complete picture of the genocide taking place. He described the systematic gassing of prisoners in the crematoriums, the use of poison gas, and a meticulous organization of mass executions. Each report was a piece of a puzzle, a grim confirmation of the scale of the Nazi plan to annihilate entire peoples. Pilecki understood that what he was documenting was not just a local atrocity, but a global tragedy in the making, one that could, if ignored, lead to the complete destruction of entire populations. Yet, for all the intelligence Pilecki was able to gather, he knew that his reports were not enough. The outside world had to act, and it had to act quickly. He knew that the longer the war dragged on, the more lives would be lost. The plight of the prisoners in Auschwitz was a microcosm of the broader war being waged across Europe, a war against humanity itself. Pilecki's reports were a cry for help, a desperate attempt to alert the world to the Holocaust before it was too late. By the fourth chapter of Pilecki's time in Auschwitz, his resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a leader of resistance, a man who would do whatever it took to ensure that the world would know the truth about what was happening inside the camp. He had witnessed the depths of human cruelty, but he had also seen the power of resistance, the strength of the human spirit, and the unyielding desire to fight back against evil, no matter the cost. The longer Pilecki remained in Auschwitz, the more he understood that his mission was not just about survival. It was about making sure that the atrocities he had witnessed would never be forgotten, and that the world would never again allow such evil to take root. As the months in Auschwitz wore on, Witold Pilecki found himself in a constant struggle against time. The war raged on outside the walls of the camp, but inside, the machinery of death continued to grind relentlessly. The very foundation of Auschwitz had been built on the premise of annihilation. Every day brought a new wave of horrors, and the scale of the genocide increased exponentially. Yet, even in this hellish environment, Pilecki's resolve to resist never wavered. With every passing day, the importance of his mission deepened. He knew that the intelligence he gathered was critical not only for the Polish resistance, but for the world. But as the war progressed, and the Nazis' efforts to cover their tracks grew more sophisticated, the stakes became higher, and the risks of exposure more dire. Pilecki's resistance efforts had evolved from small acts of sabotage and covert intelligence gathering into a more coordinated and systemic campaign. His underground network, the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych (ZOW), had grown significantly, its membership expanding as more prisoners became aware of the possibility of resistance. Over time, the resistance group had infiltrated nearly every corner of the camp, creating a vast network of individuals working together to resist the Nazis in whatever ways they could. But as the network grew, so too did the danger of discovery. The Nazis were aware of the resistance, and though they had yet to uncover its full scope, they were tightening their grip on the camp, conducting regular searches, and looking for any sign of defiance. Pilecki and the members of ZOW were fully aware that any mistake could lead to mass executions, not just of those involved in the resistance, but of countless innocent prisoners. At the same time, the scale of the atrocities being committed inside Auschwitz was becoming more apparent. The Nazis were no longer simply murdering Jews, Roma, and political prisoners. They were targeting entire communities, exterminating entire populations. Auschwitz had become an industrialized killing center, and its operations were growing more efficient. The use of gas chambers and crematoria was not only widespread, it was increasingly systematic, with the Nazis refining their methods of mass murder. Pilecki, who had once entered the camp as an observer and intelligence gatherer, now found himself at the heart of a global tragedy. He saw firsthand the unimaginable horrors of human suffering. Men, women, and children torn from their homes, subjected to unimaginable cruelty, and murdered in cold blood. The sheer scale of the genocide was overwhelming, and the realization that so many lives were being extinguished so quickly filled Pilecki with a deep sense of urgency. Despite the growing risks, Pilecki never lost sight of his goal: to gather as much information as possible, to document the crimes of the Nazis, and to ensure that the world knew the truth of what was happening in Auschwitz. His reports, smuggled out of the camp with increasing difficulty, became more detailed and urgent. He described the logistics of the extermination process, the numbers of prisoners arriving at the camp, and the methods the Nazis were using to kill. His intelligence was vital, but Pilecki also understood that it was not enough. Information alone would not stop the Holocaust. The Allies had to act, and they had to act quickly. One of Pilecki's greatest challenges in this period was the continuing threat of exposure. The Nazis had ramped up their efforts to identify and eliminate any resistance within the camp. Informants, often prisoners coerced into collaboration, were a constant threat. Pilecki knew that anyone could be a potential traitor, and even the smallest hint of suspicion could lead to the unraveling of the entire resistance network. To protect his fellow prisoners and the mission, Pilecki had to be more careful than ever. His leadership in the ZOW became more covert and strategic, and he relied more heavily on trusted members of the network to carry out operations without drawing attention to themselves. Despite the ever-present danger, the underground resistance continued to grow stronger, organizing acts of sabotage that disrupted the Nazis' operations whenever possible. They sabotaged machinery, destroyed documents, and spread false information among the camp authorities, trying to undermine the Nazis' control. Pilecki's growing sense of urgency also led him to take more personal risks. As the Resistance's intelligence network deepened, Pilecki began to increase his efforts to contact the Polish resistance and the Allies. He was aware that the Nazis were keen to prevent any information from escaping the camp, and the more he sent out, the more dangerous it became for those on the outside who were receiving the reports. The risk of exposure was enormous, but Pilecki knew that without his information, the outside world would remain unaware of the scale of the genocide. He understood that if the Allies could not be persuaded to take direct action, there was a chance that the Nazis' plans would succeed unchecked. His reports became not just an account of the horrors he had witnessed, but also a desperate call for help. A plea for the world to intervene before it was too late. But the very success of Pilecki's efforts also made it harder for him to continue. As the scale of the resistance within the camp grew, so did the Nazi crackdown. They began to search for the leaders of the underground movements more aggressively. Some members of the ZOW were captured and executed, and Pilecki knew that it was only a matter of time before the network was fully exposed. The fear of discovery was constant. Every move he made, every piece of information he transmitted, was fraught with danger. Pilecki's ability to lead the resistance from within the camp was tested as never before, and he relied on his military training, his intelligence, and his ability to inspire those around him. His calm demeanor and refusal to give in to despair became a source of strength for those around him. He was not just a leader, he was a symbol of hope, even in the darkest of times. Yet, as the war continued and the situation inside Auschwitz worsened, Pilecki also began to feel the physical and emotional toll of his prolonged imprisonment. The conditions in the camp had deteriorated even further. The food rations were reduced to a bare minimum, and disease and starvation ran rampant. Prisoners were forced to endure longer hours of grueling labor, while the daily brutality of the SS guards became more intense. Pilecki, who had once been a strong, healthy man, was now emaciated and exhausted. His body was worn down by the constant physical strain, but his spirit remained unbroken. His will to survive and to continue his mission outweighed the constant fatigue and pain. Despite the toll on his health, Pilecki continued to work within the resistance, coordinating acts of sabotage, helping to smuggle out intelligence, and offering leadership to the growing underground movement. His influence grew as more prisoners recognized the possibility of resistance and joined the movement. Pilecki had become not only a figure of authority within the camp, but a symbol of defiance against the Nazi regime. He showed the other prisoners that, even in the face of almost certain death, there was always a way to fight back, always a way to resist. His ability to maintain his resolve, even as the camp's conditions became more brutal, was a testament to his unwavering belief in the importance of the cause. Throughout this period, Pilecki's thoughts often turned to the outside world. The war was progressing, but the horrors of the Holocaust continued largely unchecked. His reports had made their way to the Polish resistance, and even to the Allies, but there had been little concrete action. The news he sent out was often met with bureaucratic delays, with reports dismissed or ignored as the world struggled to comprehend the scale of the genocide. Pilecki understood that, while he had been able to send out vital intelligence, the intervention of the outside world was still an essential part of ending the Holocaust. But as the Nazis advanced, and as the war became increasingly uncertain, Pilecki knew that it might be too late. Despite his growing sense of despair at the world's inability to respond, Pilecki continued his work. He was not just a man trying to survive in Auschwitz. He was a man determined to leave behind a record of the atrocities, a man committed to making sure that the world would remember and act. His reports, which detailed the methods of extermination and the scale of the atrocities, would later become vital to understanding the full extent of the Holocaust. By the 5th chapter of his time in Auschwitz, Pilecki had come to realize that his mission was much larger than any one person could handle. His work in the ZOW and the intelligence he had gathered were important, but the true victory would come only when the world recognized the scale of the Nazi crimes and responded decisively. The survival of millions of people and the future of Europe itself depended on the world understanding what had happened in Auschwitz and acting to stop the Nazis. Yet, despite the growing sense of desperation, Pilecki continued to fight, knowing that his commitment to the truth, to exposing the genocide, was the only thing that mattered in the face of such unimaginable evil. Even in the face of his own suffering, he never lost sight of the cause, because in the end, the fight for humanity was worth every sacrifice. The days stretched endlessly within the confines of Auschwitz, each one a monotonous cycle of suffering and survival. Witold Pilecki's resolve remained unshaken, but the cumulative toll of the brutality surrounding him began to weigh heavily. By the time he reached the 6th chapter of his time in the camp, the situation had grown even more perilous, both for himself and for those within his resistance network. The relentless machinery of death, once something Pilecki had observed from a distance, had now become a daily reality that he could not escape. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the endless procession of victims, it all blurred together into a suffocating reminder of the scale of the Nazi atrocities. Yet in the midst of this horror, Pilecki's mission took on an increasingly urgent and vital form. It was not just about survival or resistance. It was about ensuring that the world would know the truth about what was happening in Auschwitz and beyond. Despite the growing dangers, the resistance network within the camp had continued to expand. Pilecki had been successful in building a robust underground organization, ZOW, that operated in secret, often in direct opposition to the camp's brutal SS guards and the capos who acted as their surrogates. These men, prisoners themselves, were often chosen for their cruelty, enforcing the Nazis' will with the same harshness as the guards. Pilecki's leadership within ZOW, however, was unwavering. He had a unique ability to unite people, to inspire them to take risks for something greater than their immediate survival. Though the conditions of Auschwitz were designed to break the human spirit, Pilecki's quiet but powerful presence had become a symbol of defiance. His leadership was founded not on the authority of his position, but on the integrity of his actions and his refusal to allow the inhumanity of the Nazis to prevail within the camp. At this point, Pilecki had moved beyond simply documenting atrocities. His efforts had taken on a more direct and active form. He had begun organizing larger acts of sabotage within the camp, each one aimed at disrupting the Nazis' efficiency and ability to carry out their plans. The resistance had carried out small acts of subversion, like destroying camp equipment, slowing down production schedules, and even spreading misinformation among the camp's guards. These actions, though modest in scale, were not without great risk. Any slip, any mistake, would have led to immediate retribution, not just against those involved, but against the wider prisoner population. Pilecki knew the stakes. Each act of sabotage was a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable, to thwart the Nazis in whatever way they could. The survival of the resistance depended on the ability to remain undetected, and each successful operation brought the network closer to a full-scale uprising. However, even as the resistance efforts within Auschwitz grew in scope, the constant threat of exposure loomed large. The Nazis were becoming increasingly suspicious of any unusual activity within the camp, and the Gestapo had started cracking down harder on signs of discontent. The risk of betrayal was always present, and Pilecki was well aware that anyone, even those he trusted most, could be coerced into turning against the resistance. The situation had become even more fragile. The prisoners who had once joined the resistance out of shared sense of purpose were now more divided, some having lost hope entirely, while others became more willing to compromise in order to save themselves. The fear of death was omnipresent, and it eroded the moral resolve of some who had initially been determined to resist. For Pilecki, this constant struggle to maintain morale within the ranks of the resistance was as important as the acts of sabotage themselves. His ability to inspire and unite, to offer a sense of purpose even in the most hopeless of circumstances, was vital to the survival of the underground movement. The conditions in Auschwitz had deteriorated further, pushing the limits of human endurance. The daily routines had become more brutal, with the Nazis increasing the amount of forced labor and punishing even the smallest infractions with beatings or execution. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion were constant companions, and the camp had become an incubator for suffering. The food rations had become almost non-existent, and the prisoners, already weakened by the demands of forced labor, were now faced with the daily threat of death from malnutrition or disease. The few medical supplies that existed were insufficient, and the camp's medical staff, if they could be called that, were more concerned with selecting victims for experiments than tending to the ill or injured. It was a place where human life had been reduced to a mere commodity, a tool to be used until it had outlived its usefulness, at which point it was discarded. For Pilecki, the physical toll of life in Auschwitz had begun to take a heavy toll. He was no longer the man who had entered the camp, strong and resolute. The grueling labor, combined with the constant fear, hunger, and disease, had worn him down physically. His body, once strong and resilient, was now a shadow of its former self. Yet, despite the suffering and the slow degradation of his physical form, Pilecki refused to let the Nazis strip him of his humanity. In his mind, he was fighting not just for survival, but for something greater, a belief in the importance of human dignity and the need to resist no matter the odds. Pilecki's mission, however, was not just about resisting the Nazis within the confines of the camp. He had a much broader goal in mind, to ensure that the world outside knew what was happening in Auschwitz and other concentration camps. The reports he had sent out over the past months had been critical, providing the outside world with invaluable intelligence about the scope and scale of the Holocaust. Yet, the response had been frustratingly slow. Though Pilecki knew the Allies were beginning to understand the enormity of what was happening, their response had been tepid. Some dismissed the reports as exaggerated or incomplete, while others were simply too bogged down in the complexities of the war to act decisively. Pilecki, however, knew that the longer the Nazis continued their campaign of extermination, the more people would be lost. Time was running out. In this sixth chapter of his imprisonment, Pilecki also realized that his mission might ultimately be futile. His growing sense of isolation, combined with the endless suffering around him, made him question whether the outside world would ever act in time to stop the genocide. He had already witnessed the mass extermination of tens of thousands of people, Jews, Romani, and others the Nazis deemed undesirables, and he knew that without intervention, millions more would meet the same fate. The sheer scale of the Nazis' operations was almost beyond comprehension. The trainloads of people arriving at Auschwitz, the systematic sorting, the gas chambers, and the crematoria, they were all part of a horrifying, efficient process of mass murder that seemed unstoppable. But in the face of such overwhelming odds, Pilecki refused to give up. Even as he grappled with despair, his sense of duty kept him moving forward. He realized that the information he had gathered, the network he had built, and the resistance efforts within the camp could not be allowed to collapse. The stakes had never been higher. Every day that passed meant more lives lost, but Pilecki clung to the belief that if he and the resistance within Auschwitz could continue their efforts, they might be able to change the course of the war. At the very least, they could make sure that the truth of the Holocaust was documented, so that the world would never forget. Through all the hardship, Pilecki's ability to remain focused on his mission remained one of his most remarkable traits. He never allowed himself to be consumed by personal suffering or despair. He continued to inspire his fellow prisoners, encouraging them to hold on, to resist, and to fight back in whatever way they could. His leadership became a lifeline for many, a reminder that, even in Auschwitz, it was possible to stand up against the tide of evil. By the end of the 6th chapter of his time in Auschwitz, Pilecki had come to realize the full scale of the horror surrounding him. The Nazis were not just killing individuals. They were attempting to erase entire cultures, histories, and communities. Yet, amid this vast machinery of destruction, Pilecki and the resistance he led had managed to find a way to resist. Their efforts were small, but they were meaningful. In the darkest of times, they had found a way to fight back, to show that even in the face of such unspeakable cruelty, there was still room for defiance. Pilecki knew that, in the end, his mission might not result in a grand victory, but as long as he could continue to resist, as long as he could continue to gather evidence of the crimes committed by the Nazis, he knew he was doing something important. His story, and the story of those who stood with him, was one that would never be forgotten. Witold Pilecki's time in Auschwitz had become a prolonged ordeal of unimaginable suffering, yet his will to resist never faltered. By the 7th chapter of his ordeal, the magnitude of his struggle had intensified, and the mission he had embarked on had become more urgent than ever. His role within the camp had evolved beyond that of a mere survivor. He was now a key figure in an underground network, deeply enmeshed in the day-to-day operations of the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZOW. The resistance group had grown significantly since its inception, and Pilecki's leadership was indispensable. Despite the ever-present danger of discovery, the underground movement persisted, fighting against the forces of death that sought to erase them and those they cared about. The conditions in Auschwitz had become even more brutal. The Nazis, in their quest for greater efficiency in extermination, had begun tightening their control over the camp, implementing stricter discipline, and escalating their cruelty. Prisoners were worked to the brink of death, forced to endure back-breaking labor, all while facing the constant threat of being selected for the gas chambers. The daily grind of existence in Auschwitz became a horrific blur of exhaustion, fear, and death. The SS guards, once a constant threat, now acted with greater impunity. Their brutality seemed unrestrained, with even the slightest perceived infraction being punished with extreme cruelty. The capos, those prisoners who had been given authority over others, often mirrored the guards in their sadism, further compounding the suffering of the inmates. Amid this horror, Pilecki's mind remained focused on his mission. His primary goal was not just survival, but ensuring that the world would eventually learn the truth about what was happening inside the camp. He had seen firsthand the industrialized murder machine the Nazis had built, and he understood the scope of their operations. Every day, thousands of men, women, and children were brought to Auschwitz, subjected to forced labor, and then ruthlessly exterminated. The gas chambers had become a daily reality, and the smell of burning flesh wafted through the air constantly as the bodies of the dead were incinerated in the crematoria. Yet the world at large remained unaware or unwilling to fully comprehend the scale of the atrocity. It was in this dire environment that Pilecki's commitment to gathering intelligence and documenting the horrors of Auschwitz grew even stronger. Pilecki's reports, which he had painstakingly smuggled out of the camp, had begun to provide an alarming picture of the genocide being carried out by the Nazis. The intelligence he sent to the Polish resistance and the Allies was crucial, detailing the methods of extermination, the number of people being killed, and the intricate system of deportations that fed the murder machine. But the outside world was slow to act. His reports were often dismissed, overlooked, or ignored. The international community, still caught up in the chaos of the war, had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of the Holocaust. Pilecki, however, never lost sight of his objective. Even when his efforts seemed to yield little result, he continued to work, understanding that the truth must be told, no matter how difficult it was to hear. Within the camp, the network of resistance fighters continued to grow, despite the ever-present threat of betrayal and exposure. The ZOW had become more organized, its members more committed to the cause. Acts of sabotage were becoming more frequent and more daring. Though the resistance's operations were small in comparison to the scale of the Nazi apparatus, they were significant. Each act of defiance, whether it was the destruction of Nazi property, the smuggling of information, or an attempt to disrupt the camp's daily functions, represented a rejection of the dehumanization that had taken root in Auschwitz. These acts of resistance were a vital blow to the Nazis' sense of control, and they were crucial for maintaining the moral strength of the prisoners. They were reminders that even in a place designed for mass murder, humanity still had the capacity to fight back. But even as the resistance grew, Pilecki's position became more precarious. The SS guards had started to take notice of the growing unrest within the camp. The frequency of searches and interrogations increased, and the Nazis began to implement harsher measures to root out any signs of defiance. Prisoners who were caught with even the slightest evidence of resistance were brutally punished, often executed in front of their fellow inmates as a warning. Pilecki understood the danger he was in, but he knew that the work of the resistance could not be abandoned. Every action they took, no matter how small, was a step closer to the ultimate goal, exposing the truth to the world. Pilecki's ability to lead in such an environment was extraordinary. He had been stripped of nearly everything: his family, his freedom, his health, but his spirit remained unbroken. His leadership was founded not on any formal power, but on his courage, his integrity, and his unwavering belief in the importance of resistance. He was not just a symbol of defiance within the camp. He was also a beacon of hope. Even when the situation seemed hopeless, even when death seemed certain, Pilecki's calm and steadfast leadership inspired others to continue the fight. The emotional toll of life in Auschwitz was also starting to weigh heavily on Pilecki. The horrors he had witnessed day after day had a profound psychological effect. The camp was not just a place of physical suffering. It was a place where the very essence of humanity was being destroyed. The prisoners were systematically dehumanized, reduced to numbers, and stripped of their identities. The constant exposure to death, the brutal labor, the starvation, and the ever-present fear of execution took a toll on the mind and spirit. Pilecki, like many others, had to find ways to endure this psychological warfare. He found strength in his commitment to the mission, in the belief that the resistance he was leading could eventually bring about change. But the mental and emotional cost was significant, and it became more difficult to maintain the same optimism that had fueled his efforts in the early days of his imprisonment. As the Nazis escalated their efforts to crush resistance within the camp, Pilecki had to adjust his tactics. The group had to become even more covert in their operations, relying on a network of trusted individuals to carry out missions without drawing attention. Pilecki himself remained largely behind the scenes, coordinating the activities of the resistance without putting himself in direct danger. His leadership was essential, but his survival was also crucial to the success of the resistance. He was keenly aware of this delicate balance. Too many direct actions could lead to exposure, but too little could allow the resistance to lose its momentum. The 7th chapter of Pilecki's time in Auschwitz also marked a period of reflection for him. He had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, but he had also witnessed incredible acts of courage and solidarity. Despite the overwhelming odds, many prisoners still fought to maintain their humanity. They shared what little food they had, cared for the sick, and helped one another in any way they could. Pilecki's ability to maintain a sense of purpose amid such suffering became a source of strength for others. His mission was not just about gathering intelligence or fighting back against the Nazis. It was about preserving hope in the face of overwhelming despair. One of the most difficult aspects of Pilecki's work was watching the deterioration of his fellow prisoners. He had entered Auschwitz as a man on a mission, determined to stop the Nazis and expose the genocide. But as the days passed, he saw how the physical and emotional toll of life in the camp was breaking even the strongest individuals. Many of the prisoners, once proud and full of defiance, had been reduced to shadows of their former selves. Starvation, disease, and brutal treatment had broken their spirits, and some had given in to despair. Yet Pilecki never gave up on them. He continued to offer words of encouragement, trying to remind them that resistance, no matter how small, was still possible. The growing complexity of the situation inside Auschwitz made Pilecki's mission even more difficult. The resistance, though successful in many ways, was still a small and fragile movement within the vast, brutal machinery of the camp. The ZOW had carried out numerous sabotage operations, but each one carried with it the risk of total exposure. As the war entered its later stages, the Nazis began to lose ground on other fronts, and their desperation led to even more horrific measures. The gas chambers, once an efficient tool for mass murder, became more central to the Nazis' plans for annihilation. Pilecki knew that the war was drawing to a close, but the horrors inside Auschwitz continued unabated. In the 7th chapter of Pilecki's experience in Auschwitz, his commitment to the mission had never been more urgent. Every day, the resistance continued to fight back in whatever small ways they could. Every act of defiance, every report sent to the outside world, and every moment of solidarity within the camp was a step toward exposing the full scope of the Holocaust. But the Nazis were becoming more ruthless, and Pilecki knew that his time in Auschwitz was growing shorter. Yet, despite the ever-present danger and the mounting physical and emotional toll, his resolve remained unshaken. He knew that his work was far from over, and that as long as he had breath in his body, he would continue to fight for the truth.